There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the accumulated weight of financial frustration becomes unbearable, when the promises of prosperity preachers ring hollow in our ears, and when the secular manifestation techniques leave us more empty than when we began. I have walked this path myself, dear friend, through the shadowlands of financial uncertainty, where hope feels like a cruel mockery, and where every door seems bolted shut against our deepest longings for security and abundance. Perhaps you know this terrain well, this place where spiritual platitudes about money feel disconnected from the grinding reality of bills unpaid, dreams deferred, and the quiet desperation that whispers in the dark hours before dawn, that perhaps we are simply not meant for financial blessing. The modern world offers us 1,000 different keys to unlock financial prosperity, each promising to be the final answer to our struggles. We are told to think positive thoughts, to visualize abundance, to speak affirmations into the mirror each morning, or to follow this formula, or that system. Yet how many of us have tried these approaches with sincere hearts, only to find ourselves still trapped in the same patterns of scarcity and limitation? The secular manifestation movement, for all its enthusiasm, often leaves us feeling as though we are trying to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, straining against invisible forces that seem determined to keep us bound. Meanwhile, much of what passes for Christian financial teaching either falls into the trap of the prosperity gospel, with its shallow promises of material reward for spiritual performance, or retreats into a kind of holy poverty that suggests money itself is somehow evil, and that struggling financially is a mark of spiritual virtue. But what if there is another way? What if the answer lies not in choosing between faith and reason, between the spiritual and the practical, between the eternal and the temporal, but in discovering how these apparent opposites are meant to work together in beautiful harmony? What if the very struggles that have brought you to this moment of searching are not evidence of your failure, but invitations to discover truths about money, manifestation, and the nature of divine provision that could transform not only your bank account, but your entire relationship with abundance itself? I invite you to pause here and consider whether you have ever truly been heard in your financial struggles, whether anyone has ever looked past the surface symptoms of your money troubles, to understand the deeper spiritual and psychological dynamics at work. If this resonates with you, if you feel a stirring of recognition that there might be wisdom here worth exploring, I would be grateful if you would share that recognition in the comments below. Perhaps you could write something like this: "Yes, I'm ready to discover how faith and reason can work together to transform my finances." Your engagement helps this message reach others who might be walking a similar path, and it also creates a space where we can build a community of honest seekers who are tired of superficial answers and ready for something deeper. Let me begin by addressing what I observe to be one of the fundamental misconceptions about manifestation that keeps so many sincere people trapped in cycles of frustrated effort. The secular approach to manifestation often treats the universe as though it were a cosmic vending machine, where the right combination of thoughts, emotions, and actions will automatically dispense the desired results. This mechanistic view reduces the magnificent complexity of divine providence to something resembling magic, where we attempt to manipulate spiritual laws as though they were merely psychological techniques. The problem with this approach is not that it is entirely wrong, but that it is incomplete. It recognizes certain real principles about the power of focused intention and aligned action, but it misses the crucial element that gives these principles their proper context and power. The truth about manifestation, as I have come to understand it through both reason and revelation, is that it is not primarily about getting the universe to give us what we want, but about aligning ourselves with what God wants to give us. This is not a subtle distinction, but a revolutionary one that changes everything about how we approach financial transformation. When we understand that manifestation is fundamentally about cooperation with divine will, rather than manipulation of spiritual forces, we begin to see why so many sincere efforts at improving our financial situation have fallen short of their intended mark. Consider for a moment the nature of divine provision, as we see it revealed throughout Scripture. When God provides, it is never merely about meeting material needs, but about accomplishing purposes that extend far beyond the immediate blessing. The manna in the wilderness was not just food, but a daily lesson in dependence and trust. The multiplication of loaves and fishes was not just about satisfying hunger, but about revealing the nature of divine abundance and compassion. The prosperity of Joseph in Egypt was not just about personal success, but about positioning him to save nations during famine. In each case, the material blessing was the vehicle for spiritual and eternal purposes that transcended the immediate circumstances. This understanding transforms our entire approach to financial manifestation. Instead of trying to bend spiritual laws to serve our desires, we learn to align our desires with divine purposes. Instead of demanding that God conform to our timeline and our methods, we discover how to cooperate with His timing and His ways. This is not passive resignation, but active participation in a process that is far grander and more effective than anything we could accomplish through willpower alone. The practical implications of this shift in understanding are profound. When we approach financial challenges from this perspective, we begin to ask different questions. Instead of asking, "How can I make more money?" we begin to ask, "How can I be more useful to God and others in ways that naturally result in financial blessing?" Instead of focusing primarily on what we want to receive, we begin to focus on what we have to offer. Instead of trying to force outcomes through mental effort, we learn to create conditions in our hearts and minds that make us receptive to divine guidance and provision. Now I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. If you have been listening to these words with your heart as well as your mind, if you have felt something stirring within you that recognizes truth when it hears it, I want to invite you to share that recognition. The journey of financial transformation can feel lonely, especially when we are trying to integrate spiritual principles with practical needs. But you are not alone in this struggle, and your willingness to engage with these ideas honestly creates space for others to do the same. Take a moment if you feel moved to do so, and leave a comment sharing what has resonated most deeply with you so far. Perhaps you could say something like, "I'm beginning to see how aligning with divine purpose could change my approach to money," or simply share whatever feels authentic to your experience. This kind of engagement does two important things. It helps the algorithm share this message with others who might benefit from hearing it, and it creates a community space where we can support one another in applying these principles to our real lives, with their real challenges and real hopes. The first manifestation technique that I want to share with you grows directly out of this understanding of alignment with divine purpose. I call it the practice of consecrated intention. This begins not with deciding what we want and then asking God to bless our plans, but with offering our financial lives completely to God and asking Him to show us His plans. This might sound like spiritual bypassing or impractical idealism, but I assure you it is neither. It is rather the most practical approach possible, because it aligns us with the source of all true abundance. Consecrated intention works through a process of what I might call informed surrender. We bring our financial needs, dreams, and concerns honestly before God, but we hold them with open hands rather than clenched fists. We acknowledge our desires while remaining open to the possibility that God's provision might come through different channels or in different forms than we originally imagined. This is not about giving up our dreams, but about expanding our vision of what might be possible when we stop limiting God to our current understanding of how provision must work. The practical application of this technique begins with a daily practice of what I call financial prayer mapping. Each morning, before you engage with any financial planning or money-making activities, spend time in prayer, specifically offering your financial life to God. This is not a time for begging or bargaining, but for listening and aligning. Ask God to show you His perspective on your financial situation. Ask Him to reveal any areas where your thinking or behavior might be out of alignment with His purposes. Ask Him to open your eyes to opportunities for service and usefulness that you might have overlooked. Most importantly, ask Him to give you the grace to trust His provision, even when the path forward is not immediately clear. This practice of consecrated intention creates what I call a receptive posture of heart and mind. When we approach our financial lives from this position of surrender and openness, we become available to guidance and opportunities that we might otherwise miss. We stop forcing doors and start noticing which doors God is opening. We stop trying to manipulate circumstances and start learning to cooperate with the circumstances God provides. The second technique builds naturally on the first and involves what I call imaginative visualization, rooted in scriptural truth. The secular manifestation movement has recognized something important about the power of imagination to shape reality, but it often lacks proper grounding in eternal truth. When we use our imagination in cooperation with divine revelation, however, we tap into something far more powerful than mere wishful thinking. This technique involves regularly spending time visualizing your financial life as God sees it, not as your current circumstances suggest it must remain. But this is not fantasy or denial of reality. Rather, it is seeing present reality through the lens of divine possibility and promise. When you visualize, you are not trying to create something out of nothing, but rather to perceive and align with something that already exists in God's eternal plan. Begin by grounding your imagination in specific scriptural promises about provision and blessing. Meditate on passages that reveal God's heart for your financial well-being, His desire to provide for His children, and His ability to open windows of heaven and pour out blessing. As these truths take root in your heart and mind, begin to see your own life through their lens. Imagine yourself stewarding resources wisely and generously. Imagine yourself free from financial anxiety because you are rooted in trust in divine provision. Imagine yourself blessed not just for your own comfort, but so that you can be a blessing to others. The key to this practice is ensuring that your visualizations align with divine character and purposes, rather than merely with personal desires. Ask yourself whether the financial abundance you are imagining would make you more like Christ or less like Christ. Ask whether it would increase your dependence on God or decrease it. Ask whether it would enhance your ability to serve others or tempt you towards selfish indulgence. When your imaginative visualization is properly rooted in divine truth and purpose, it becomes a powerful tool for aligning your heart and mind with God's intentions for your financial life. The third technique involves what I call faithful action rooted in spiritual discernment. One of the great errors of much spiritual teaching about money is the suggestion that faith somehow eliminates the need for practical action, or that trusting God means sitting passively and waiting for provision to fall from heaven. This is neither scriptural nor practical. True faith always expresses itself through appropriate action, and divine provision typically comes through natural channels that require our cooperation and participation. The challenge is learning to distinguish between faithful action that cooperates with divine provision and anxious striving that tries to force outcomes through human effort alone. This distinction is not always obvious, and learning to make it consistently requires both spiritual maturity and practical wisdom. The key principle is that faithful action flows from peace and trust, while anxious striving flows from fear and self-reliance. When you are contemplating a particular course of action related to your finances, whether it involves looking for a new job, starting a business, making an investment, or any other practical step, begin by bringing that action into prayer and asking for divine guidance. Does this action align with your sense of God's calling and purpose for your life? Does it arise from wisdom or from desperation? Does it require you to compromise your values or integrity? Does it enhance your ability to serve God and others? Or does it primarily serve selfish ambitions? As you learn to evaluate potential actions through this grid of spiritual discernment, you will find that some opportunities that initially seemed attractive lose their appeal, while others that you might have overlooked reveal themselves to be perfectly aligned with divine purpose. This process of discernment becomes easier with practice, as you learn to recognize the difference between the peace that comes from divine approval and the anxiety that comes from self-directed striving. The fourth technique involves developing what I call a grateful stewardship mentality toward money and resources. One of the greatest obstacles to financial blessing is the tendency to approach money from a position of scarcity consciousness, where we see resources as limited and provision as uncertain. This mentality creates a spiritual and psychological environment that actually repels blessing and limits our ability to recognize and receive divine provision. Grateful stewardship begins with recognizing that everything we have, no matter how little it might seem, comes from God and belongs ultimately to God. This is not a burdensome responsibility, but a liberating truth that frees us from the anxiety of feeling personally responsible for generating our own security. When we understand that we are stewards rather than owners, we can approach financial decisions with wisdom rather than fear, and we can be generous rather than hoarding, because we trust that our source of supply is inexhaustible. The practical application of this technique involves developing daily practices of gratitude for whatever financial resources you currently have, no matter how modest they might be. Begin each day by acknowledging God as the source of your provision and thanking Him specifically for the money, possessions, and opportunities He has already given you. This is not about pretending that your current situation is perfect or that you don't have real financial needs, but about recognizing that God's faithfulness is already evident in your life in ways you might be taking for granted. As you cultivate this attitude of grateful stewardship, you will find that your relationship with money itself begins to change. Money stops being a source of anxiety and starts being a tool for serving God and blessing others. You stop seeing financial challenges as threats to your security and start seeing them as opportunities to exercise faith and experience God's faithfulness in new ways. This shift in perspective creates space for divine provision to flow more freely into your life because you are no longer blocking it with fear and scarcity consciousness. The fifth and perhaps most important technique involves what I call patient persistence in divine timing. One of the greatest sources of frustration in the journey of financial transformation is the gap between when we recognize divine principles and when we see those principles produce visible results in our circumstances. This gap is not a flaw in the system, but a crucial part of the process through which God develops our character and deepens our faith. Divine timing rarely matches human expectations, but it is always perfect from the perspective of eternal purpose. The delay between planting and harvest is not wasted time but necessary time for growth, development, and preparation. During this season of waiting, our hearts are being prepared to handle blessing wisely, our character is being shaped to steward resources appropriately, and our faith is being strengthened to trust God's goodness even when circumstances seem to suggest otherwise. The practice of patient persistence involves maintaining faith and continuing faithful action even when immediate results are not visible. It means continuing to pray, continuing to align your actions with divine principles, continuing to practice gratitude and generous stewardship, and continuing to trust God's goodness even when your bank account doesn't immediately reflect the internal changes you have made. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of financial manifestation because it requires us to operate by faith rather than by sight, to trust spiritual realities that are not yet visible in material circumstances. But this is also where the greatest transformation occurs, both in our external situation and in our internal spiritual condition. As we learn to remain faithful during seasons of waiting, we develop the kind of deep-rooted trust in divine provision that actually attracts blessing and creates sustainable financial transformation. During this process of patient persistence, you will likely encounter what I call the spiritual obstacles to manifestation, those internal barriers that have been built up over years of disappointment and struggle. These obstacles often masquerade as practical concerns, but are actually rooted in deeper spiritual issues that must be addressed for true transformation to occur. The first of these obstacles is what I call inherited scarcity, the unconscious beliefs about money and provision that we absorbed from our families and communities during our formative years. These beliefs operate like invisible programming, shaping our expectations and behaviors around money in ways we may not even recognize. If you grew up hearing phrases like money doesn't grow on trees or rich people are greedy or we can't afford that, these messages created neural pathways that associate financial limitation with virtue and abundance with selfishness. Breaking free from inherited scarcity requires both spiritual renewal and practical rewiring of thought patterns. You must learn to distinguish between wise stewardship and fearful hoarding, between godly contentment and resigned poverty, between humble dependence on God and passive acceptance of lack. The second spiritual obstacle is what I might call wounded trust, the result of past experiences where we felt that God failed to provide when we needed Him most. Perhaps you prayed fervently for financial breakthrough that never came, or you followed spiritual principles faithfully only to experience greater hardship. These experiences create protective mechanisms in our hearts that resist fully trusting divine provision again. Healing wounded trust requires honest acknowledgement of our disappointments while choosing to believe that God's apparent silence or delay was not evidence of His absence or lack of care, but part of a larger story whose purpose we may not yet understand. The third obstacle is performance-based faith, the unconscious belief that God's provision depends on our spiritual performance rather than on His character and promises. This creates an exhausting cycle where we try to earn blessing through good behavior, prayer, and religious activity, rather than receiving blessing as a gift of grace. When our financial situation doesn't improve despite our efforts to be good Christians, we either become discouraged with God or more frantic in our religious efforts. True manifestation flows from relationship rather than performance, from knowing we are loved rather than trying to prove we deserve love. The final obstacle I want to address is what I call misplaced identity, the tendency to derive our sense of worth and security from our financial status rather than from our identity as God's beloved children. When our identity is tied to our net worth, financial struggles become existential threats rather than temporary challenges. We begin to see ourselves as poor people rather than children of the King who happen to be experiencing financial difficulty. This misplaced identity creates desperation that actually repels blessing because it approaches money from a position of need rather than from a position of abundance consciousness rooted in spiritual truth. Now, as we near the end of our time together, I want to acknowledge that the journey I have described is not an easy one. The techniques I have shared are not magic formulas that will instantly solve all your financial problems, but rather spiritual principles that, when applied consistently and faithfully, create the conditions for genuine and lasting transformation. This transformation involves not just changes in your external circumstances, but changes in your heart, your mind, your character, and your relationship with God Himself. The integration of these principles into daily life requires what I call a gradual awakening to divine abundance consciousness. This awakening does not happen overnight but unfolds gradually as we consistently apply these techniques and allow them to reshape our fundamental assumptions about money, provision, and our relationship with the divine. You may find that your first breakthrough comes not in the form of increased income, but in the form of decreased anxiety about money. You may discover that your initial transformation involves not receiving more but appreciating what you already have with greater depth and gratitude. As this awakening progresses, you will begin to notice subtle changes in how opportunities present themselves to you. Doors that were previously invisible become apparent, connections that seemed impossible begin to form naturally, resources that you never knew existed start to become available. This is not coincidence, but the natural result of aligning yourself with divine purposes and opening yourself to receive provision through channels you had not previously considered. The most profound aspect of this transformation is what I call the shift from scarcity consciousness to abundance consciousness. Scarcity consciousness operates from the assumption that there is not enough to go around, that someone else's blessing diminishes your own, and that you must compete, manipulate, or struggle to secure your portion of limited resources. Abundance consciousness, by contrast, operates from the understanding that God's resources are unlimited, that blessing others increases rather than decreases your own capacity to receive, and that there is more than enough for everyone when we align ourselves with divine principles of provision. This shift in consciousness affects every aspect of how you relate to money and resources. You stop hoarding and start sharing. You stop competing and start collaborating. You stop grasping and start receiving. You stop trying to force outcomes and start trusting divine timing. Most importantly, you stop seeing money as an end in itself and start seeing it as a tool for participating in God's work in the world. The practical manifestation of this consciousness shift often surprises people with its naturalness and sustainability. Instead of dramatic windfalls that create as many problems as they solve, divine provision typically comes through increased wisdom in managing existing resources, expanded capacity for generating value for others, and enhanced ability to recognize and seize opportunities that align with your gifts and calling. This kind of provision feels less like magic and more like the natural outworking of spiritual laws that have always been in operation but which you are now learning to cooperate with rather than work against. The path of integrating spiritual principles with practical financial wisdom requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to trust God's process even when it doesn't match your timeline or your expectations. There will be moments of doubt, seasons of testing, and times when it feels like nothing is working. These are not signs that you are on the wrong path, but necessary parts of the journey through which God develops the very qualities of character that will enable you to handle blessing wisely when it comes. If these words have stirred something in your heart, if you sense that there is truth here that could transform not just your financial situation but your entire relationship with divine provision, then I want to invite you to take a step of faith. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and give this video a like to help it reach others who might benefit from these insights. More importantly, begin applying these techniques in your own life with patience and faith, trusting that God is working even when you cannot yet see the results. Remember that you are not alone in this journey. There is a community of believers who are learning to integrate faith and reason, spiritual principles and practical wisdom in their approach to money and manifestation. Your engagement with this content, your willingness to share your experiences and insights, helps build that community and creates space for others to find encouragement and wisdom for their own journey. The transformation you seek is possible, not because these techniques have magical power, but because they align you with the source of all true abundance, as you learn to cooperate with divine purposes rather than trying to manipulate spiritual laws, as you align your desires with God's heart rather than demanding that He conform to your plans, as you practice faithful action rooted in trust rather than anxious striving rooted in fear. You will discover that provision flows from sources you never expected and arrives through channels you never imagined. This is the promise of divine abundance, not just enough to meet your needs, but enough to enable you to be a blessing to others and to participate in God's work in the world with joy rather than anxiety, with generosity rather than scarcity, and with faith rather than fear.